Hello there, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michael Kugelman. I am the director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute. We are really delighted today to be hosting a virtual book launch for Hurt Sentiments, Secularism and Belonging in South Asia, published earlier this year by Harvard University Press and authored by the University of Virginia historian, Dr. Neeti Nair. Let me say just a few brief words about Dr. Nair and then about her new book. Dr. Nair has been described as one of the best historians of South Asia of her generation, which is an assessment that I believe to be fully on the mark. She is an associate professor of history at UVA, where she teaches on 18th to 20th century South Asia, on partition, and on blasphemy politics in South Asia. Prior to her newest book, she published another book called Changing Homelands, Hindu Politics and the Partition of India, and she is currently working on a product called India's Partition, Politics, Culture, and Memory. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. She is an extremely prolific scholar. Neeti has served as a fellow at the Wilson Center, both in residence and most recently in a non-resident capacity. She has contributed immeasurably to the activities of the Wilson Center, and especially the South Asia programming that I oversee. This includes the key role that she played in helping organize a day-long Wilson Center conference in association with Asian Affairs Journal, which turned into a Routledge-edited volume on religious freedom in South Asia. Neeti is appreciated and admired across the board at the Wilson Center, and so I know that I speak for the entire Wilson Center community in saying congratulations for the new book. Speaking of the new book, Hurt Sentiments is a study that touches on some of the most pressing and complex issues in South Asia today. It is a book about secularism and religion and how these issues have evolved and played out in public life and in policy and in broader debates in the region over the years. It also describes how these have contributed to the challenges, or really one could describe it as a crisis, of censorship and hate speech and related issues that prevail in the region today. Even the most casual observer of developments in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh would understand the contemporary relevance of these issues. So this is very complex, controversial, and contested terrain, but if there's one scholar capable of making sense of all this, it would be Neeti Nair. So we really look forward to hearing from her today about the book. We're also very happy to have with us three other eminent scholars who have kindly agreed to offer commentary on Hurt Sentiments. We have with us Tarun, Khaitan, a professor of public law and legal theory at Oxford and head of research in the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at Oxford. He will offer some thoughts on the book. We also have with us Dr. Ali Usman Qasmi, associate professor of history at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ali Riaz, who has long been associated with Northern Illinois University, where he has been a distinguished professor of politics and government, though he is currently visiting researcher at the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. He will discuss the book as well. So we have those three commentators, and we're really fortunate to have three distinguished scholars from them, a lawyer, an historian, and a political scientist, all to respond to Neeti's book. So in just a moment, Neeti will give a presentation about her book and its findings, and our commentators will respond, and then we'll have a discussion. We will take questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience and if you have a question, you should see on your screen a little box where you can type in a question and submit it. Please do that, and do list your name and affiliation if you'd like. So with that, let's now turn things over to Neeti. Over to you, Neeti.
Thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction. It is an honor to be here with you all. I would like to begin by thanking Michael Kugelman for his support ever since I joined the Wilson Center as a residential fellow in 2017. The Wilson Center, I have to say, provides its fellows not only with office space, library resources, research interns, and excellent programming, but also the essential calm one needs to think, read, and write. I'm also very grateful to the discussants, Professors Tarun Khaitan, Ali Usman Qasmi, and Ali Riaz, for agreeing to be part of this event and for reading my book. I look forward to their comments very much, so I will not take too much of your time with my opening remarks. I thought I'd begin with a few words about how I came to write this book in its present avatar. Although the book begins and ends with the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests of 2019, early 2020, I began working on this book several years before the first Citizenship Amendment Bill was introduced by the present government in India. In grant applications, I wrote that I wanted to determine how colonial era laws that sought to restrict speech that might hurt religious sentiments, such as sections 153A and 295A of the Indian Penal Code, had been deployed in post-partition India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as part of these nations' penal codes. I noticed that the increasing misuse of these laws by religious minorities showed how an extremist fringe was becoming mainstream, leading to similar newspaper headlines of vigilantism against religious minorities across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, making it urgent to examine these laws. As I began the research, however, I realized that a legal history of these laws via a study of case law and jurisprudence was already known and made available in standard books such as Ratan Lal and Dheeraj Lal's textbooks of the Indian Penal Code. But as a historian, I was in a position to write a deeper history of the context within which these laws were said to be required, invoked, and implemented. So the book became a study that situates allegations of hurt sentiments and demands for censorship in a wider set of debates on secularism and state ideology in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. I argue that it is through the process of debate in the press, the courts, Constituent Assemblies, Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, National Assembly of Pakistan, the Jatiya Sansad of Bangladesh, that demands for and meanings of secularism or a theocratic state evolve. Crucially, what I found is that debates in one assembly drew on arguments and laws being made across the border in another assembly, or simply on misperceptions of the nation across the border, uspar. I argue that the question of belonging, who belongs where, has always been central to the meaning of secularism in South Asia, at least since Gandhi's articulation of secularism in the immediate aftermath of partition in 1947. Therefore, questions of citizenship and minority rights back in the public domain because of the passing of the Citizenship Amendment Act must be considered in the backdrop of the longer history that I trace. As I researched the book, I had to reckon with the repetitive and cyclical nature of communal violence in post-partition India, and with it, the place of Muslims in India. These questions are first raised in 1947, then again in the wake of a series of deadly riots in the 1960s when the Jan Sangh calls on Muslims to Indianize, again during the Lok Sabha debates on inserting secularism into the preamble during the emergency, and in various minority inquiry reports leading all the way to the Rajinder Sachar report. As a historian, I recognize a sameness to the urgency of Muslim belonging in 1947 and again in post-2014 India that is deeply troubling and also paralyzing. Reading columns devoted to politics in Pakistan in the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh's magazine, The Organizer, for the 1950s, I realized that the Sangh Parivar had kept very close tabs on neighboring Pakistan. Indeed, the Sangh's ideology relied on Pakistan as much for its progressive policies towards Muslims, such as the reform of Muslim personal law in 1961, as it did for its regressive attitude towards its own religious minorities. Why were Hindus not allowed to become head of state in Pakistan? The sources that I consulted were a revelation in other ways. The heated debates in the Constituent Assembly and later National Assembly of Pakistan reminded me that in Pakistan too, we have the argumentative desi. So much ink has been spilled on martial rule that we forget that when Pakistan was under civilian rule, it too witnessed a period of intense debate. Again, the process of debate and discussion matters as much as the fact that it was truncated by military rule. Awami League member Hussain Shahid Sohrawardi's warning during the Constituent Assembly debates in 1956 that the ulema would become a Frankenstein has aged well, as have the words of Congress Member of Parliament Bakar Ali Mirza, who underlined the overweening loyalty of Sanghi members of parliament to the predicament of Hindus in Pakistan, and the Pakistani Congress leader Basant Kumar Das's lament that Pakistan's leaders were more concerned about the predicament of Indian Muslim lives than of the minorities within Pakistan. I thought I'd read a few pages from the book, paragraphs, to give you a sense of the book. This is from the epilogue, page 242, Secularism as Belonging. Protesting the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, in the winter of 2019, hundreds of thousands of Indians in Delhi, Aligarh, Bijnor, Lucknow, Mumbai, Muzaffarabad, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Mangaluru, Amravati, Chennai, and many other cities and towns recited the preamble to the Indian Constitution. They laid special emphasis on the word secular while renewing their pledge and allegiance to the Constitution. In their rising crescendo, the everyday secularism that typified the usually silent, ordinary person on the street rose to challenge the Indian state's obvious lack of commitment to secularism. In the outpouring of voices and sentiments, in the unfurling of the Indian flag, and the waving of posters of lawgiver Ambedkar and comrade Bhagat Singh, mingled the poetry of Faiz Ahmad Faiz and Habib Jalib, poets from across the border with Pakistan. Jalib's poetry echoed through waves of demonstrators. जुल्म की बात को जहल की रात को जुल्म की बात को जहल की रात को मैं नहीं मानता ऐसे दस्तूर को सुबह बेनूर को मैं नहीं मानता I will not accept this oppression, this night of ignorance. I will not accept this rule, this dark morning. Those protesting and rallying, chanting and marching refused to accept the discrimination embodied in the newly amended Citizenship Act that would fast-track citizenship only for refugees belonging to minority religious communities from the three Muslim majority nations of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, and coupled with the draconian National Register of Citizens, NRC, discriminate against India's own minority Muslim community. Secularism was no longer an abstract constitutional principle. It had become an imperative to uphold, a slogan to embrace fully, wholly, in substantial measure. Ideas matter. A return to founding moments and critical debates allows us to closely disaggregate and reassemble the constituent elements of establishment ideology, be this secularism or the ideology of Islam that, while being defined, sometimes became punitive to those deemed to be religious minorities. In the wake of a partition along religious lines, Gandhi upheld secularism as the Congress creed in what was to be his last session of the All India Congress Committee. To Gandhi, secularism meant that Muslims belonged in India on terms of equality and respect. This is why he insisted on reading from the Quran, along with the Gita, the Bible, and the Zendavesta in his prayer meetings amid the catastrophic violence of partition. Such a secularism was deeply respectful of religion. It was never opposed to religion. This ideal Gandhian India was unacceptable to the likes of Nathuram Godse, whose hate speech viewed as appeasement any gesture of acceptance of religious difference. The struggle between the India of Gandhi and the India of Godse has been reinvigorated by the debates that accompanied the passage of the CAA. In neighboring Pakistan, the right to belong on terms of absolute equality was the main theme of Jinnah's inaugural address to the Pakistan Constituent Assembly, meant to assuage the anxieties of Pakistan's religious minorities. Allegiance to Jinnah's address became, in the decades to come, a barometer to Pakistan's commitment to minorities. As much as it was cited and invoked by minorities and their Muslim defenders, it was ignored and erased by Pakistanis who sought to use Islam to create an unvarying ruling majority. It is hard to miss the anguish with which Bengali members of the Pakistan Constituent Assembly prophesied that the dual symbolism of the name of the state, Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and the fact that the head of the state would have to be a Muslim would lead to non-Muslims being considered inferior. Already, legislator Peter Paul Gomez warned that non-Muslims were being evicted from their lands on the grounds that Pakistan was an Islamic state and that non-Muslims do not belong. Whereas the Islam of the Objectives Resolution ensured tolerance towards religious minorities who were permitted to practice and proselytize, the ideology of Islam after the War of 1971 drew harder, increasingly impenetrable lines between Muslim and non-Muslim, seeking in definitional clarity a way to erase evidence of ambiguity, shared symbols and practices, and a shared culture. More recently, the weapon of choice has been the loosely drafted Zia-era blasphemy laws of the Pakistani Penal Code. Centering the anxieties of minorities within the founding debates of the state allows us to situate these blasphemy laws in a longer history of marginalization. While mine is a history book about a discrete portion of time, about 7 decades of experiments in secularism and religious majoritarianism, examined through the lens of hurt sentiments, I hope it will encourage others to re-examine these decades to put forward new narratives to imagine a secular South Asia. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Neeti. You've given us a lot to think about, and certainly you've given us so many people. I hope those watching a good reason to read the book. So thank you for reading some excerpts from the book as well. It's very helpful. Let's now turn to our 3 respondents. Before we do that, though, I just wanted to apologize for an error I made in my introduction in introducing our eminent commentators. I made an error in noting Ali Riaz's affiliation. He's with Illinois State University. He's currently at University of Gothenburg in Sweden. His home base is Illinois State, so I regret that error. So with that, let's start with Tarun. So Professor Khaitan, why don't you unmute and we'll go to you first.
Well, thanks very much, Michael, and to the Wilson Center for inviting me and encouraging me to read this fantastic book. Everybody who's here, I think, will benefit from buying it and reading it. My comments are restricted to the India chapters. I fear I received the book late and have not managed to read all of it. Having said that, I should also say something on the style of the book. It is extremely well written and it's very readable. In fact, it's unputdownable. I think Neeti has managed to traverse that very difficult line between academic excellence and popular accessibility. So even if you're not a historian or indeed a lawyer, I think you'll find the book very accessible and quite easy to read, despite its profound insights. So so much in style. I read the book as a lawyer, and obviously not as a historian. And therefore, I'll organize my comments around legalistic themes. These are not really, I'm in sympathy with the approach, the methodology, and the claims in the book mostly. So I have nothing really to push back against. Certainly not, no more than minor friendly suggestions. But I want to talk about two broad ways of thinking about the minority question, as it were. And I'm using constitutional legalistic framings. One is a framing of what in some of my previous work I've called ideological or discursive accommodation. And the second alternative frame is what Roberto Gargarella in his book on constitutions has called engine room solutions. The distinction is this: sometimes laws in constitutions, when trying to accommodate minorities, or indeed to hurt them, when laws are weaponized against them, act on the discursive, symbolic, ideological plane. And their main role is ideational, discourse management and discourse framing. A very different approach is what Gargarella calls the engine room approach, where you're not so much focused on organizing the political discourse, but thinking about who is in the engine room of the Constitution. So who wields the levers of power. And that debate is extremely key to the first substantive chapter on the framing of the Constitution around Gandhi's assassination in the book. So on the one hand, we start with a rejection of the demand for separate electorate, which, by the way, is a quintessential tool for engine room participation. And as I understand it, by the way, a lot of this material was new to me. So you're telling also, even to those people like me who are used to the Constitutional Assembly debates and who have read quite a bit on it, some of the debates that you track on the engine room solutions were really new to me. And I'm just in terms of novel information that was really insightful and helpful in thinking about what might have been. And that was, in fact, my main emotion during my main sort of emotive response was what might have been while reading the book. Anyway, so as I read that chapter, I think there's an initial starting point move away from separate electorate that's seen as the foundation of partition and towards joint electorate, right? And separate electorate is what in the constitutional theory literature is called a consociational tool, right? This is a tool of accommodating minorities who have legitimate fears of being overwhelmed by majoritarian democratic processes, and they're given a sort of political insurance within the constitutional settlement. I've posted a link here in the chat to one of the key debates, key readings on this, right? Which is a consociational tool that you will be guaranteed political representation and will not be overwhelmed by democracy. Right? Now, having rejected separate electorates and having opted for joint electorates, the amelioration of that were the provisions for reservations, for quotas for Muslims in both, as I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Neeti, in both legislatures as well as in public employment, the bureaucracy as well as politics, and somehow through the process of constitution drafting, that gets whittled down and then eventually lost. So while reservations would have also been a tool of consociational accommodation, we see proposals that then start targeting the electoral system. right? So you have proposals for a proportional representation system with STV voting, which is a single transferable vote, or even a multi-member constituency system with cumulative voting proposals, right? And these are, forgive the jargon, in the literature, are called centripetal tools, right? Centripetal tools, unlike consociational tools, seek to accommodate minorities, but by using neutral methods, right? So these electoral mechanisms don't directly track religion, although their effect would have been to give Muslims better representation in the political domain. And one of the key reasons for preferring centripetalism in the literature is that they tend not to concretize ethnocultural identities in politics, right? So anyway, so that whole journey was fascinating to me. Of course, what ends up happening is that all of these accommodation demands, starting from separate electorate to reservations to an electoral system that might be more minority friendly, they're all rejected, right? And they're almost rejected on, at least your telling, or at least my reading of your telling, by stealth, in that it's not clear. There isn't a clear conceptual or reason, justification for why the Constituent Assembly is giving up on, is moving, evolving towards a majoritarian engine room design, right? And that is, I think, an extremely novel contribution to the literature, and I think one of the parts that I found most interesting. What happens instead, and this is a relatively sort of better known story, is that the debate on minorities moves to the discursive and the ideational sphere, right? So here, and not just minorities, the Hindu nationalists as well, right? So they're also discursively accommodated by the secular majority in the Constituent Assembly. And I have a paper here on how directive principles became the key vehicle for putting in agendas like cow slaughter prohibition, like the Uniform Civil Code, within the Constitution, and of course the priority and the supremacy of Hindi as the official language, first amongst the official languages, right? So that is a very interesting transformation. And again, when we see the revisiting of the debates on secularism in the 70s during Indira Gandhi's time, the battle remains in the discursive sphere. It was very interesting to see that the parliamentary debates reassert the engine room questions, right? There are people who bring up the importance of the what we in politics today call the bread and butter issues, minority representation, reservations, quotas, etc. But what the government does is its intervention is very ideational, very saliently ideational, right? Amending the preamble and putting the word secular in it is, I think, important in signaling what the state wants to do, but it stays completely clear of any engine room solution. There is no mechanism adopted, despite demands, again, in the 70s, to guarantee any real political power in the hands of the Muslims. And what this seems to be suggesting is the Congress's appointment of itself as the benign, benevolent guardian of Muslim interests in India. And here I'm going onto a limb because I'm not a historian, it seems a resistance to direct political empowerment of Muslims. And whether that is a legacy of partition, whether the worry about not creating another Muslim League, or what is the explanation, I don't know. Whether it's just entirely self-serving and not creating a political challenge to the Congress. And that's a wise worry, by the way, because if we see the trajectory of caste politics in India, the engine room solutions that India does adopt on caste in legislative reservations, as well as in public employment and public education quotas, caste parties do emerge and become the first credible challenges of the Congress party domination in India, right? So maybe the Congress was somewhat wise in thinking about not doing this on religion as well. But I thought that contrast was really interesting as one way of looking at the debate that you highlighted. So I'll just say, after offering that framing, I just end with sort of 2 or 3 quick questions, small questions for you, Neeti, to think about. So the first is this entire debate on the meaning and the definition of secularism, and it seems that despite so much sort of noise around it, it seemed to me that there was extremely broad political agreement on what Indian secularism meant, this idea of Sarva Dharma Samabhav, right? Which, by the way, I'm sending you Cecile Laborde's recent paper, where she makes a similar artic conceptualization of Indian secularism, right? But anyway, so it seems to me that while everybody is criticizing the absence of a definition, there is no real alternative definition on the table, as it were. So how much of this debate is a real debate, right? And what, if anything, would have been lost in worrying about this definitional problem? Because it seems to me nobody, and even when Vajpayee goes on to become the Prime Minister of India later, again defines accepts the definition of secularism as somehow, at least rhetorically. So that's the first thought. The second is, I'm reading this book as, it's very hard for me to do this, right? But like, how might a Hindutva sympathizer read your book, right? And they might read your first couple of chapters, and the very little attention paid to the 80s, the Shah Bano affair and the Rushdie affair as vindication of the victimization narrative, etc. Right? So I'm just inviting you to think about both the choice of not focusing or not focusing, but not attending to the Shah Bano and the Rushdie affairs, and what the Hindu right calls minority appeasement as sort of framing the Sehmat narrative. The third challenge, and this is a particularly naive challenge because I have not read the chapters on Bangladesh and Pakistan at all. But as you know, Ashish Nandi's distinction between Hindutva and Hinduism, and even the claim that Hindutva is the death of Hinduism, is quite well accepted in the literature, right? That Hindutva is embarrassed by Hinduism's pluralism, Hinduism's tolerance, Hinduism's open attitudes towards sexuality, for example, and wants to create a much more militant, uniform, hierarchical religion, right? And that claim suggests that the Hindu fundamentalist politics or political discourse in India, it's not really a theocratic discourse. It's a totalitarian discourse. It's an authoritarian discourse, but it has no genuine commitment to Hindu doctrine, whatever that might be, right? That it's a political ideology in service of some version of Hindu interest, right? So I'm putting pressure on the distinction between Hindu theocracy, Hindu doctrine, whatever that might be, and Hindu interests as defined by the group. And again, I've sent a paper that tracks this distinction, right? I was interested in whether you have thoughts on that, and whether there's a similar distinction to be found between Islam and political Islam in Pakistan or Bangladesh, or whether what passes as Islamic fundamentalism is actually more, or tracks theology more closely, or whether the sharp divide exists there as well. The next thing I want to mention is, I don't know if you've seen Mohsen Butt's, I think, excellent paper, which again I'll send you, on, I should have mentioned this while talking about Indian secularism's definition, on thinking about the idea of Indian secularism as or Gandhian secularism as all religions are simply multiple paths to the same God, as quintessentially Hindu, and actually at odds with Islamic and Christian approaches to religion and theology, and whether even in the mainstream inclusive Gandhian vision of Indian secularism, there isn't an embedded Hindu core in thinking about plural paths to the same God. And the final thought, and I suspect I'm over time now, so I'll shut up with this final thought, which is thinking about the militant democracy proposals that come up in the 70s and again perhaps in the 90s, right? The echoes of sort of the German approach to militant democracy were very strong there. The idea of using the strong arm of the law to really come down like a ton of bricks on Hindutva and the RSS, and of course part of the reason why that does not happen is the RSS's ability to this amoeba-like ability to be a cultural organization as well as a political front, depending on what's suited it and making therefore legal intervention. Complicated in Congress's own worries about not coming down too strongly, perhaps, or maybe even sympathy with what is called soft Hindutva. And I'm just wondering, the big question about militant democracy that the world is asking today, in many contexts, is whether it is counterproductive, that whether it does more harm than good, right? So was there a perhaps unwitting wisdom in the Congress's approach to not use law to come down hard on the RSS, whether that would have just made it an even more potent unspent political force in the subcontinent, given more fuel to its narrative of victimization? I know that these counter narratives, they're impossible, counterfactuals are impossible to answer, but I just wonder, and this is sort of in some ways my emotive thoughts about, or affective thoughts about what might have been when reading your book, what might have been had India gone down the strong militant democracy route. But then part of me also thinks, could it really have been worse than where we are currently? So I'll shut up there. Thank you very much for this fantastic book.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Khaitan, for those really very useful comments and some very thoughtful questions that you posed there at the end for Neeti as well. And indeed, we will give Neeti an opportunity to respond to your points and those of the others. But for now, let's move on to Ali Usman Qasmi. So please, sir, why don't you unmute, and look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you, Michael. Congratulations, Neeti, on your new book. And I'm so very happy to read this book and comment on it, because I've been working on similar themes. And I found your chapter on Pakistan extremely useful for my own work, and also because, I'm also fascinated with this notion of foundational movements or founding movements. And I completely agree with what you said about, in a way, there is a much sustained kind of engagement with Indian democracy, Indian constitution, and for good reason. But at the same time, there is a paucity of literature when it comes to Pakistan, where it's usually as if presupposed that that Pakistan was created as a majoritarian Muslim state. Within 2 years, the objective resolution was passed, which called for the creation of an Islamic state or a theocracy or whatever. And there were, these long periods of political instability followed by martial rule. And then we move on to Afghan jihad and 9/11 and whatnot. So, I mean, this is very, very refreshing to see such intellectually rigorous engagement with the notion of democracy in Pakistan, especially in its very foundational moment, formative phase. And I hope that my work will also sort of like complement what you have done so brilliantly. And it's also rare for a book to engage with such a wide spectrum of sources, and making a conscious effort not to restricting your analysis to just India, because as we know, it's a very well-known critique of much of scholarship on South Asia, where South Asia has been equated with India, and to the exclusion of everyone else in the region. So your book, in that sense, is, I think, it's not just for the theme of it, but I think it's also like part of your political project to engage with the wider sort of debate which has happened. And as you rightly pointed out, there is so much of borrowing of ideas and learning from each other for whatever political purposes people were doing that. But there is completely, it completely makes sense. I've also found the evidence for it in my work. So before I comment on the chapter, I just wanted to point out, I mean, you use the term Frankenstein very often in this book, and it's kind of like a metaphor. And I was reminded that this is not specific to the late 40s, the 1950s. In fact, Frankenstein as a metaphor is invoked much before, during the 1940s, as Muslim League and India and Congress are debating the terms of partition, where the pro-Congress English press frequently, in fact, in one of the cartoons, they showed Jinnah as the one who is unleashing who has unleashed this Frankenstein of communal hatred, and now has a hard time putting him back in the box, basically. And the metaphor of Frankenstein in Pakistan has a much longer history now, and it's where it has been used frequently in English press to describe Pakistani state's policy of sponsoring Afghan jihad, nurturing militants at home, and how these Frankensteins, they continue to haunt us. So I just wanted to put it out there, and secondly, interestingly, coming to this point of mutual borrowing and learning, I was recently informed that, and I came to know that BJP actually has an online library. And the BJP library, one of the items which they have on their website is the resignation letter of Jogindernath Mandal. So when Mandal resigned as the president of Pakistani Constituent Assembly, he wrote a long letter listing all the reasons why, and in his words, there is no room for Hindus in Pakistan. And for obvious reasons, BJP wants to put it out there. And so the BJP library, in fact, has a lot of similar literature. So if you're looking for any Orientalist historiography, any account of that, any book that you need for your teaching or research, I would recommend that you go to BJP's online library. It's a fantastic resource in that sense. Anyways, now coming to the book and specifically to the chapter, I was reminded of I read the introduction and I was reminded of Sudatta Kaviraj's recent work which he presented, where he is arguing that nation state was perhaps the only model which was available to the Congress and the Muslim League, and much of the anxiety of whether Punjabi Hindus, which was your previous work, fantastic book, anxiety of Punjabi Hindus or that of Muslims in North India or minority provinces was it was derived from this idea of nation state, which they thought, and correctly so perhaps, that it is inherently majoritarian, and that's within such a majoritarian notion of nation state as the only possible kind of political ideology or political structure which was available. How can there be an accommodation for a minority group, whether it is defined along religious lines or ethnic lines? And that, in his opinion, is determines not just the negotiations for as they continued during the 1940s, but also perhaps the way the new republics were founded in the post 1947 period. So I think in that sense, then I follow this up with your individual chapters on India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So I'll only focus on Pakistan, but so in your theorization or in your account, you're trying to tell us as to how all these different states, with all their different kinds of baggage, historical baggage, and other political reasons, they opted for a specific notion of secularism, where in case of India, you are referring to a more Gandhian notion of respect for all religion. It's not anti-religion as such. Whereas in case of Pakistan, where I thought, and you can clarify, that you took a kind of a charitable view of the objectives resolution, where that there could not be a possibility to live as Muslims without being considerate towards non-Muslims. So perhaps maybe it's I've misread your argument, but I can understand that you are in a way reading or describing the argument, at least, which was being put forward by someone like Sir Zafrullah Khan or by Liaqat Ali Khan, who was the prime minister, that in their articulation of the objectives resolution is in a way their idea of a sort of accommodation, as a sort of toleration, which they never describe as secularism, but in their understanding, that if in India's case secularism is about respect for all religions, in case of Pakistan, the objective resolution stipulated that there is no theocracy in Islam, and hence it will be there will be radical equality, where everyone will be will be accepted. And third is that of Bangladesh, and Professor Ali Riaz will talk about that. But to me, it seems, and again, Professor Riaz is the best person to talk about it, that, in that sense, Bangladesh comes with a much more radical notion than both, as compared to both India and Pakistan. And I would like to know your opinion about it as well. But I would like to point out, I mean, I'm interested in knowing as to why, I mean, it seems that you are not engaging with some of the critical sort of like ideas about secularism, in the sense that the ways in which, as Tarun has pointed out, Ashish Nandi's work and others, like how they, in their opinion, that it does not have to be top-down kind of a state ideology, and that there are other ways in which there is an inherent capacity within religious praxis itself to accommodate, to provide accommodation, and and if secularism is about accommodation and tolerance, there are other quote unquote indic ways of doing that. And also, the critique of secularism as the only valid way within which political ideology, the modern state can function, as if the excess of religion needs to be contained and put aside. And it's only through secularism as a political project, as a political ideology, that the ideals of modern citizenship and equality and liberty can be achieved, right? So I just wanted to know and push you more like about like why it seems as if there is this celebration of secularism as the only way. Because I mean, I realize that's a very dangerous trope, and this is in a way becomes the kind of like Hindutva argument as well, that the idea that the again the Indic ideas are essentially in that sense tolerant, just like the proponents of Islamic State, of a specific kind of a liberal Islamic State back in the 40s, argued that its Islamic State is inherently pluralistic or tolerant. So that needs to be, I think, the notion of secularism, the critique on secularism needs to be highlighted. Now, second is that I wanted to argue, emphasize that you have already obviously talked about the context of these debates, but I wanted to emphasize more on the like how, and you have extensively used Constituent Assembly debates, but I would like to ask you more about how much of most of these debates and the contents of these debates were contingent on a number of factors. And here I think that the role of Maulana Maududi and Jamaat-e-Islami should have been more sort of like emphasized. I mean, you do mention him, but in my opinion, I mean, at least what I have seen is that Maududi, in a way, despite the fact that he was unable to secure or to translate his whatever ideational impact into electoral impact, but he seems to be the first person who pushed for this, who created that an enabling kind of an environment in which it became inevitable for something like objective resolution to be passed. Because Maududi was the person who said that when the government of West Punjab asked for government servants to take an oath of loyalty, Maududi raised an objection, and he sort of he was opposed to the idea. He said, until and unless the state sort of either it becomes an Islamic state, or it gives an indication or promises to become an Islamic state in future, he would. So he was being reserved about it, that it should not be. You should not be committing yourself to servicing a state which is going to be built on the idea of Western democracy, which was his concern. That Muslim League's leadership being inherently not observing Muslims, or not being scholars of Islam, they will not be able to set up an Islamic state, and hence to serve a state which believes in man's sovereignty is shirk, is more dangerous, and especially if it's been created by Muslims themselves, then it's the biggest sin possible, right? So the contingency of these debates the role of Maududi, and regardless of what the assembly was promising, what Liaqat Ali Khan was promising, what Zafarullah Khan was promising, how it eventually, the objective resolution and the whole idea of an Islamic state was shaped, or the outcome of it was then, in my opinion, sort of like predetermined, because it was built on Maududi's ideas and his views, which were actually publicly pronounced through Radio Pakistan. Second is, I wanted to, talking about the contingent sort of like nature of these debates, I wanted to push you on this idea of how much of you think 47 can be understood, and the debates which took place as a decolonial moment as well. Like how much of the debate which takes place in Pakistan, whether it is objective resolution or whether the idea of an Islamic state, it seems that Liaqat Ali Khan is trying to, you can say that it's all politics, it's all instrumentalizing of Islam for political purposes. But at the same time, you can see that maybe, and I think he is making in his mind an earnest attempt to create something new. And his speech is very clear that, the world has tried excesses of Western materialism and godless communism. We will create something which is new, which will provide a new vision for the entire world. And that's we're going to create through an Islamic state. And you find this kind of like the resonance of this kind of decolonial movement, and to create something new, and that there's a lot of optimism, which I think it's not just in the assembly debates, but in newspaper articles, letters to the editor, and where that this is a new state and we're going to build something new. So that I think is I don't know how much you agree with this assessment, but I found this to be, at least in my reading or my research, that was a strong factor which determined the outcome of these debates. And especially if you read the various educational policies which were issued from time to time, especially the one which was issued during Jinnah's lifetime, just 2 months after the creation of Pakistan, it's very clear about how there has been Orientalist kind of misconceptions about Islam, how wrong history has been taught, and now that we have created our own state, we will use it for creating an ideal Islamic state where everyone's right will be protected, the minorities will be free to profess their religion, so on and so forth. So these were like overall my assessment, my critique, and now I just wanted to ask you a question, which is about so I understand, and you've brilliantly summed up like the especially, I think, and I completely agree with you, the role of Bengali opposition. That, and in fact, in my work, I also come to this conclusion that there was only Bengali opposition. Ideologically, there was only Bengali opposition in Pakistan. There were next to none sort of like opposition which was coming from West Pakistan, very, very few voices. And that is why post 1971, there is this kind of an ideological uniformity in Pakistan, because the entire opposition was gone. So it's only about the post 71 debates. If you look at the Constituent Assembly, the constitution making debates in the post 1971 period, it's the questions which you find in the 1950s are completely missing. There is a broader agreement. It's only about how much more can we add to it in terms of Islamic content. And in fact, at one point, one of the members, religious members, elected members of the parliament, he even went to the extent of saying that the principles of policy should not ban slavery. There shouldn't be a blanket ban on slavery, because unforeseen circumstances can, wars can necessitate slavery. So let's not be too, in a way, not be too rigid about it. So that's the shift which happened, and that sort of like points out the role of Bengali opposition in the assembly, and that the missing of it created a uniformity, sort of like ideological uniformity. But my question was that, so while during the 1950s a substantial Hindu minority was the reason why a joint electorate was not acceptable, why there was this, very strong anxiety about, Bengali majority, but I fail to understand the persistence of that anxiety in the post 1971 period, where already there was the situation where almost close to 98% of population was Muslim, and yet, that the Pakistani state continued with that sort of like a very with that kind of identity crisis and this forceful imposition of a religious ideology. In fact, it becomes even more rigid in its interpretation of Islam, as opposed to what it used to exist till the 1950s and the 1960s. And also, if you think, there is now, for whatever reason, there is sort of like a reversal of sorts which is happening, where in Pakistan there is a coalescing of a new form of Pakistani identity, which is emerging, which centers on the role of constitution, where there is, to use Habermas's term, there is some sort of constitutional patriotism which is emerging in case of Pakistan, and that there is, ironically, there is some kind of a reversal, like the Indian Republic, on the other hand, is receding from that kind of centrality, where, because the kind of consensus which was provided. I mean, it's wrong to maybe use it, and the consensus was in any case fragile. But in any case, whatever the consensus of the Nehruvian state secularism, which lasted for so long, is now being undone, unraveled, or rewritten as to how it's being reversed. And on the other hand, in case of Pakistan, do you see the beginnings of a process where there is some kind of consensus around constitution, which is finally happening? And once again, thank you for having me, and thank you for writing this wonderful book.
Well, thank you very much to you, Dr. Qasmi, for some very rich, very valuable comments as well. Really terrific. And I know that Neeti is probably thinking about all these wonderful questions and points that she'll want to respond to. But we'd like to, let's now hear from Ali Riaz, our third commentator, who I think may speak a bit more in Bangladesh. But your general comments, Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. And thanks to Neeti for such a wonderful book. Congratulations. Michael asked me to focus in Bangladesh, but when I got the book, I couldn't resist myself to read the entire thing quickly, given such a wonderfully written book, and it provides so much food for thought and so incisive that I couldn't just I had to leave other things aside, and I read it. It's a very readable, and it provides the historical background and put it in the context of the contemporary one. So, as a political scientist, I think that despite the fact that you are claiming yourself as a historian, I would say you have done a wonderful job of writing a book that political scientists should read it carefully. And I would encourage everyone to do so. And in your book, as I see it, there are three things that have intersected. You talk about feeling, there are sentiments. You talk about the secularism and the belonging issue. They have intersected because they are rightly so intersected in case of South Asia, particularly when we're looking at the history, the legacy of 1947, and since then the debates that we have seen in India, not only in the Constituent Assembly, but subsequently even today, that we are witnessing as the Muslim majority and minority questions are there, the ever-increasing majoritarianism that we are witnessing in case of not only in India, but maybe more so in case of India later than what we have witnessed, as our colleague Ali Qasmi has noted about Pakistan and others. But for the sake of Bangladesh, I will take these three things apart and try to address them separately, because I think there are issues that needs to be untangled here. The first and foremost is the question of the secularism that you brought up. And the historical narratives that you put, it is a well, you have weaved a very interesting narrative. It is as I said, is well written and very easily readable. But the linearity of it that's something that I'm a little bit concerned with. What is my concern here? That when you were talking about the rise of the notion of the secularism within the context of the Bangladesh movement and the emergence of Bangladesh since 1947, there are a few other elements that might have helped you to understand the complexity of it. Indeed, you have looked into Abul Hashim's writing. But Abul Mansur Ahmed could have been could be another choice that could have helped you to understand this complexity, especially in the 1950s and 60s. But similarly, this question that the secularism question is not a post-47 question in case of Bangladesh. It has been featuring in a different fashion. The question of religion question that we have seen within the context of the language, say 48-52 period, but even before that, in 1930s, that we have seen the question emerged when there was this organization based in Dhaka, which called itself Emancipation of the Intellect, Buddhir Mukti Andolon, as they called it, the Shikha movement, the magazine that they came out. And there was a debate, intense debate on this issue. It was not about talking about the secularism or not, but it was a question of how the identity question be dealt with when we are talking about the religion and language. It's the culture question, the language question, the religion question. Do we see ourselves as a Muslim first or the Muslim alone? So even if we don't go back to the cusp of the previous century, but at least in the 1930s, which actually has been extended in the conversation. And that is what the background has been in the conversation of the 1940s, particularly in 1948-52, and the language question came up. In similar fashion, if you look at the 1960s, it is not only that within the political realm this conversation was. The conversation, say, for example, there is a new magazine, if I remember it correctly, New Horizon, edited by Kansar Mushid, who has been speaking about them. This is one group of people. But at the same time, what we are missing here in your book is that there is a parallel, thing that was going on, in the Danish Pakistani culture with respect to not only in opposition to Rabindranath Tagore in 1960s, but also with respect to the Muslim identity and Pakistani identity. And here, very interestingly enough, in some cases those are juxtaposed, in some cases they're not. Farooq Ahmad's poetries were, in some cases, transcended the Pakistan. But Talim Hussein's poetry were more so inward in case of Pakistani identity. And you would see this is not only subscribed by the names that I'm saying, usually which is associated with the Muslim identity. If you look at the literature that has been produced and the magazines, in 1965 war of Pakistan, India, Pakistan. And I can go on and quote Kabir Chaudhry, who is known as the secularist and the nationalist of the Bangladeshi movement and the Bengali nationalist. He's profoundly and profusely talking about 1965, supporting the Pakistani identity, not only Pakistan, but also Muslim identity question. Whether it is even, I personally revere very much Hassan Hafizur Rahman, his writings also, Sufia Kamal, or for that matter, others. You see that this question was there, but the question was not a question of secularism per se. And that is what the interesting part is this. The Awami League's adoption of this secularism as a term, without any interpretation whatsoever, in 1972, could have been built on that conversation, but that has not taken place. That conversation of transposing that from a cultural realm, while having a conversation about identity, with respect to the role of religion in this identity, have been somehow transcended everything and suddenly became, a political, jargon, so to speak, and been incorporated into the constitution. You speak about in your book about the Tajuddin Ahmed's, reference to secularism even in 1971. But if you look at the whole 1971 during the War of Independence. You don't see any conversation about this. Suddenly in 1972, in Bangladesh Constitution, again in the Constituent Assembly, if you go back and look into it, very interesting thing happened. What is that? That is, someone would be very surprised to know that one of the members who put a note of dissent, a written note of dissent, after the constitution was adopted, mentioned that Bangladesh should actually adopt state religion and Islam should be the state religion. Very interesting. And we tend to see it coming back in 1988 as a political ploy by a military regime called H.M. Rashad. But that was there. And also the long tradition of having this conversation that could have been encouraged, but that was not. If you look at the debate within the Constituent Assembly, as I have tried to look into, what you have seen that has been shut down by this whole assertion that yes, we are secularist and secularist alone. What does that mean? Yes, you have referred to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's pronouncement that it is not having a religion, which he has spoken several times, including in the Constituent Assembly, to my recollection, at least twice, that he has been talking about it. But nevertheless, there hasn't been any conversation, on this. On the state principles of these 4 state principles, democracy is undebatably, acceptable because that is what actually led Bangladesh. If 1970 election was accepted by Pakistani elites, I don't think 71 would have happened, in similar fashion that if you look into the other one, the nationalism. And this is where the majoritarian comes in. That is where the belonging question, let me now move on to this belonging question. In case of Bangladesh, the belonging question is not about the religion to begin with, because in the social realm, in the identity issue, being a Muslim was not a binary to being a Bengali. Never been, but Bengalis have been Muslim, Bengalis have been Hindus, Bengalis have been. But what is the belonging issue came Bangladesh in the context of Bangladesh, particularly if you look at the Constituent Assembly, how the whole question of indigenous people have been shut down by all kind of conversation. The Bengali, we are the Bengali. And this is very interesting part, that in Constituent Assembly, in the draft, the Bengali, that the national identity would be Bengali was not in the draft. It was actually introduced by a member as an amendment, and then it was incorporated. And when a representative from then Chittagong Tracts, Mr. Larma, tried to oppose it, he was completely told to pretty much shut down and said he walked out, he came back and had the conversation, but he continued this. And again, irony lies here that he actually, what did he suggest? He said Bangladeshi, that we should be called Bangladeshi, which came back in 1975 with Ziaur Rahman's introduction to Bangladeshi. But what is the belonging issue? The belonging issue in this instance is the majoritarianism. That is the one that we have seen. And in case of Bengali nationalism, how it had bulldozed all other kind of imagination of the nation, because at any point, I don't think there is one single imagination of a nation. Bengali nationhood that we have seen, there wasn't a single one. Was there a dominant one? Of course, it became dominant one with the Awami League representing. But the way we tend to see in the mainstream narrative that there is a connection between the Awami Leagues, or for that matter, Bengali nationalism and secularism. I have a little bit of discomfort on that kind of leap of faith that it is, because that is, I don't see that one, because I don't see in 1970. And you have mentioned about LFO, Legal Framework Order, within which the Awami League actually accepted to enter into the election of 1970 and kept on insisting that this is what would, well, Muslim identity was the question, was there the question that there won't be any kind of measure that would be contrary to Quran and Sunnah, which was just the Pakistani ideals at that point, and there is understandably they had to accept it. Whether it's a strategy or it's a ideological conviction, that's a different issue, but they had to, and that is what they did. They never spoke about. And as you have mentioned, as we know, that there has been repeatedly Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Awami League throughout the 1970s had to say, we're not against Islam, we're not against Islam, because there was a campaign, again, my colleague Ali Usman Qasmi has brought up the Maududi issue, the Jamaat-Islami issue, because that was the campaign of the Jamaat-Islami, that the Awami League is the anti-Islam, and hence they should be rejected. So the belonging question, if we take the second piece of the puzzle, the belonging question in case of Bangladesh, the majoritarian argument that came out of this nationalist movement, somehow marginalized the others. Not only, I'm not talking only of the, Chitong hill tracks or other indigenous people, but it also became an ideology that completely, silenced the other voices. Look at the treatment the Biharis, quote unquote Biharis got, which the entire question of Biharis was there, the entire community was stigmatized as if they were the only opponent. Wasn't there people within the Bengali community who collaborated with the Pakistanis? Of course they did. A political organization by itself, Jamaat-Islami, we know, and not only Jamaat-Islami. There are 4 organizations were banned even before the the exile government went in, the interim government from Mujibnagar or India, however you put it, before they went into Bangladesh, they actually banned 4 organizations. It is not the constitution itself. That was a different issue, that there would be no religious political organization. That even before that, 4 organizations were banned. The government in exile decided. Why? Because of their opposition to Bangladesh and their engagement with the Pakistan. So that means there were Bengalis. So how we saw the stigmatization of this entire Bihari community. And that marginalization continued for decades that we have seen, even today. So the belonging question is this majoritarian question. What happened in recent decades, what we have seen is conflation of these majoritarianism with the religion question, meaning that now what I see in case of Bangladesh is this majoritarian argument of Bengali Muslim identity that has been constructed. Is it a state project then? Should we actually say that it is post-1975 state project? Had this been only a state project of the military government, which I have written extensively on how it was done, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge that it is not only a state project, there is a bottom-up process also, because in the society, this is a society where the Tariqa Muhammadiyya movement was there. This is a society which produced Tituli, and that has not gone away. We can push it out of this realm, but they're going to stand their state, and that has come back because we never had this conversation. The secularism question, if you look at it in case of Bangladesh, which I keep on telling, when secularism was included, there wasn't a popular conversation about it. There was no referendum. There was no conversation. When Jawar Rahman decided to, take it, toss it out, there was no conversation whatsoever. And then went through this another amendment when Sheikh Hasina brought it back. There's no conversation on that. Did Bangladeshis consent to it? Was anybody asked that whether they want it or not? And this mishmash of having a state religion and secularism idea, there's nothing but a strategic move, but it is not a commitment. Now, what is the commitment could be? The Bengali translation of this secularism, dharma niropekkota. Who is niropekha from the state neutrality? Is state neutral from religion or religion neutral from the state? How we are going to discuss this one? Where would we place this? So this is the very interesting situation that we have witnessed and continue to see this. And the last point with respect to the herd sentiment that you have mentioned. Bangladesh inherited these colonial laws, right? The ones that you have mentioned. It is in the book, it can be used. And there was a move at one point that pretty much a copy of Pakistani law, the blasphemy law, was supposed to be, and it was introduced as a bill, but it was rejected or at least not discussed. What is happening in Bangladesh then? Isn't this herd sentiment thing is there? Yes, it is not the colonial legacy, it is the new construction of law. Digital Security Act is a case in point. More cases have been filed with respect to the hurting the religious sentiment, with respect to the other community. Mostly it is the Muslim community. This is very interesting, It keeps on reminding me of Arjuna Padurai, the fear of small numbers, At the end of the day, whether it is in Pakistan or in Bangladesh or in case of India, it is always the majority is afraid of this small number because, But the point is that this herd sentiment idea is, although it is borrowed from, in some ways borrowed from this colonial legacy of 295 and so on and so forth, the colonial penal code, but it has been politicized to that extent that it is no longer a question of actually hurt sentiment. It is really people get hurt, their sentiments hurt because for making a comment, someone even if someone has made a rash comment, does it actually hurt them? And you can equate with this that if someone is posting a comment hurting the prime minister or the minister or something, suddenly people feel hurt by that. Sorry, they're in public life. They are not hurt. They are not going to the court. So how it is politicized, this sentiment in this fashion that it is, in large measure, when this question of, the moral legitimacy, remain very weak, if not non-existent, then you keep on inventing these hurt sentiments, things, and use it, politicize it. And so that's why, I enjoyed reading your one, but there are a few other things I would love to see that if going forward, in some cases, the way you are equating secularism with Awami League needs to be interrogated a little bit. I would love to see that one, and there are other ones, that other debates and conversations, and to a certain extent questioning this meta-narrative that has been created by the recent years, and particularly looking at it, suddenly we hear about constitution, but we don't hear about how the constitution making process, how it was rushed into. Is it an achievement? Yes, it is an achievement. But at the same time, whether that achievement should also be questioned because of these inadequacies that we have seen. So those are the things that came. But as I said, your book gives us this opportunity to think about these things. And that is why I would like to congratulate you. And it's a good book. I would like everyone to read it. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Ali, and thanks to the three commentators for some really rich, thought-provoking material. The bad news is that we have less than 15 minutes to go, but definitely want to give Neeti an opportunity to respond as she can to the points that she would like to respond to. So I know that you probably won't be able to get to everything, Neeti, but please, we'll go back to you, and we look forward to hearing your responses to these very thoughtful commentaries from our three other experts.
Thank you so much for this very detailed engagement to all the three professors. I'm really, really grateful, and you've given me enough to think about for a long time. And I will have to listen to the recording of this event again to really fully take in all of these comments. And Tarun sent so many articles, recommended articles on chat that I have to also now read. So very quickly, I thought I'll just, pick up on just a few things, and then maybe we'll have time to take a few questions from the audience as well. So I suppose what I was trying to do in this book on the question of secularism was to, as much as possible, bring these primary sources to the reader. On how the meanings of secularism itself are being debated and changing over the decades, and how there is, so much of insistence on, from the left, for instance, in the 1970s, on concretizing the meaning of secularism so it leads to something tangible. And I thought, Tarun's distinction between the sort of constitutional legal framings, the discursive framings, and the engine room solutions was really very well put and very useful in thinking through this. I do want Hindutva sympathizers to read my book. And I thought it was very useful for me as well to, see what was being written in The Organizer through the 1950s and the construction of this victimhood narrative, it was all a revelation to me too. So I was trying to think with it. Tarun asked why I did not attend to Shah Banu when I was framing the Sehmat narrative. And I think I was trying to restrict myself to cases of censorship. And so I found that, the Aubrey Menon, the little vignette on Aubrey Menon's book being banned was interesting because, even Khushwant Singh refers to it in the Los Angeles Review of Books interview that he gives when he says that there's always been Hindu hurt sentiment long before the Satanic Verses case came about. And I thought that even this question of a temple to Ram can be seen as a question of Hindu victimhood, which it is. I mean, this is something that the RSS has been talking about for decades, which is why it really gets a certain degree of cachet in the late 1980s. I also completely agree with what, your summary of Muhsin Bhatt's argument as Indian secularism as quintessentially Hindu. Even this idea, isn't there an embedded Hindu core to Indian secularism? And I would say, absolutely, there is. And that is also something that we need to, come to terms with when we talk about all that is glorious, even theoretically, about Indian secularism. But what I was really trying to do, and I know my voice is there all through the text, but I was really trying to do is put forward these primary sources and how they are talking about Indian secularism. On this question of militant democracy not clamping down on RSS by law, I suppose so. Yeah, I suppose it might have made things even worse if the RSS were banned. But I don't think that is really the question. It's also, the question of the book, Bunch of Thoughts. You have a law put forward, and the book is allowed to be translated into these multiple languages without any sort of excision. And it sort of begs the question, what are these laws for? And even now, the Law Commission of India is all gung-ho about introducing more laws, but what is the point if you're not going to implement these laws when they are really needed? Ali Qasmi's questions, can 1947 be understood as a decolonial moment, creating something new? Absolutely. I have to say that when I was writing the book, and I finished writing it about 2 years ago, I was overwhelmed by all the different meanings that were being put to the word decolonial at that moment. And so I chose not to use it in the book, but absolutely, I completely agree with you that this is definitely should be seen as a decolonial moment. And I really look forward to seeing your book, Ali. And I do think that I need to, there needs to be a lot more work done on Maududi and, his role in pushing for the objectives resolution in this early period. My reading of the debates really suggested that this question of accommodating non-Muslims was of paramount significance to the members of the Constituent Assembly in that very early period. Professor Ali Riaz, thank you so much for these comments. Of course, these debates go back, as you said, to the 1930s, and there is so much of, there are all these literary societies and poets writing all through this period. We were part of the same conference in 2018, where Professor Deena Siddiqui had also presented a paper on the question of the Chittagong Hill Tracts, and she read the Constituent Assembly debates very differently. And I also agree with you that there is a majoritarian element to in the way that the Constituent Assembly debates talk or do not talk enough about, what it means to be Bangladeshi at that moment. And I also agree about that there was really no conversation about secularism not enough of a conversation, not of a question through all of these Constituent Assembly debates and later day amendments. I was also teaching a class at the University of Virginia on free speech, where we talked a lot about the Digital Security Act that you mentioned, and how that is the tool which is being used as a tool of censorship in present-day Bangladesh. I know I haven't done justice to your comments, but I thought I would just give 5 minutes at least to any audience questions we might have. Thank you again so much.
Well, thank you, Neeti. Really appreciate that. So I guess what we could do, yes, we only have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to group a few questions together. Actually, that's fairly easy to do because there are a lot of similar questions. And also throw in a simple question for me, and that's this. One thing I like to ask people who have just published new books is, what was it that surprised you the most in the course of your research? What did you come across? Was there one thing that you came across, or more than one thing you came across that you really didn't expect, or that you just found really striking? And then, there are a number of questions about people, personalities, and we heard about Madhuri a bit earlier, but there's sort of a general implication of these questions about people is, for you, who do you think were some of the key personalities that we really should know more about in the course of your research? Who are the people that really stood out the most, the thinkers, the leaders, the political figures, whatever the case may be?
Thank you so much, Michael. Those are great questions. So the Pakistan Constituent Assembly debates really surprised me the most, and the National Assembly debates that I read while I was at the Library of Congress. I felt that I hadn't learned, I didn't know about all of this debate on the question of non-Muslims. So while writing the book, I was really educating myself a lot about these debates. I was also surprised at the pushback from so many Pakistani legislators. Let's say, during the 4-day-long debate on the political parties bill that was passed at the time of Ayub Khan, I found the pushback against what is called the ideology of Pakistan extremely interesting. On the question of personalities, I thought Hussain Shahid Sohrawardi was a revelation. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in the 1950s for me was a complete revelation. I just didn't expect that kind of pushback on the, what does it mean to be an Islamic state? There was such a lively debate in 1955-56. All of this was absolutely new to me. And I was, of course, child of the 80s and 90s, very intrigued by the debates around Sehmat and the parliamentary debates in 1993, where a lot of the people we talk about today, Nitish Kumar, pop up in interesting ways and ask, why is secularism not being defined? And what does secularism mean? And does it mean that you're allowed to hurt sentiments? So I found that writing a book that covers this entire span really allowed me to track how people talked about the question of secularism through these decades. And so within the folds of one book, you sort of get this real spectrum of conversation that takes you, I feel, through the history of, modern South Asia. So it was useful for me to put things together in these, I agree, very large chapters, but it allowed me to see what had changed. I also was intrigued by Indira Gandhi and how she was portrayed, especially in The Organizer, in the late 60s, early 70s, the kind of misogyny that she had to go through before her election campaigns, I found really quite unbelievable. It was a shock. And I also found the debates between her and Atal Bihari Vajpayee very interesting in the Lok Sabha in the early 70s. We're almost out of time, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Neeti. It's so important, I think, to bring rich, nuanced historical context to very fraught contemporary issues like blasphemy and Hindutva and so much else that we hear about and talk about in a South Asia context, and certainly in the three countries that are the focus of your book. And we really got that here. So I really have to, again, thank not only you, Neeti, but also our three commentators who provided such rich context and responses and food for thought, so to speak. Just before we end, there were a few questions about how best to get a hold of your book, Neeti. And I know that this is a virtual launch, so we can't actually have someone selling books in real time. But very briefly, what is the best way for people to purchase your book?
So it's available in the US and in Europe on Amazon. And it's available in India on Amazon as well through HarperCollins. It's not yet available in Pakistan and Bangladesh, but I know that Harvard University Press is in conversation with local distributors. And so hopefully it's just a matter of time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So with that, we will have to wrap. So again, thank you to Neeti Nair. Thank you to Tarun, Khaitan. Thank you to Ali, Usman, Qasmi, and to Ali Riaz. So this is a really wonderful discussion. And I know that I'm going to go back and listen to the recording because there's so much that I still need to absorb. We will have this posted on the Wilson Center website on our YouTube channel. So look for that very soon. But I really want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thank you for our audience for tuning in. This was wonderful. So with that, again, congratulations for the book, Neeti. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.